Greg Pasternak from RSL35, and today we're going to continue talking about lessons that can help you accurately identify the 9 county San Francisco Bay Area stream types. So let's get into it. As always with this series of presentations, I'm going to acknowledge Dr. Jihao Wang, who has been lead analyst in helping me to develop the stream classification. Many people participated in data collection, and this is a 7-institution collaboration funded by the University of California Office of the President through the state of California. The topic for this video is riverbed and riverbank composition. Composition is like, what is it made out of? And typically that's going to be some kind of sediment or human-built materials. So we're going to use the term artificial composition or natural composition to distinguish between when materials are just there, they're just already there, they were brought in sort of, by natural processes over a long period of time, or humans have come in and brought the materials and placed them on the bed of banks in a mindful way to create typically a hardening or a protected bank situation. Here are some photos that illustrate some artificial composition. So on the left, concrete. If you have concrete, obviously that's an artificial material. In the lower right is a similar kind of material, typically called shotcrete, where it can get sprayed out onto the banks. And notice in this case, there is a veneer of emergent or submerged aquatic vegetation and algae on the riverbed. And so there may even be like a thin veneer of fine sediment or organic material that's deposited. However, remember, California has a wet season and a dry season. So it's common that some amount of fine sediment might deposit onto the cement bed, and that's not going to change it from being a cement bed because that material isn't enough to change the functionality of the river. But plenty of times you might only have shotcrete just blasted onto the sides and the bank is left natural. In this photo in the upper right, you see gabion structures that have been built. This is where you have like a wire mesh, usually fairly heavy enough to hold in rocks, and then it gets filled with rocks to make like a Minecraft-like cubes or rectangles that get laid in this staircase fashion. In this setting, you can also see there is a full-on cement lower part of the bank as well. So I think that gives you an idea. There's plenty of other materials, and I'll show you some photos, whether it's wood or kind of anything else. If humans have placed it and it's defining the shape and structure of the banks or the bed, then it's artificial composition. What are some of the issues that come up? So let's look at some more examples. Here on the upper right, we have like a rock revetment, or also called riprap. So typically you're going to put the largest boulders right along the toe, although I don't see that in this photo. But you can just see that this is just a deeply incised channel that has rock slope protection. Here's some more gabion structures where they're trying to irrigate and get vegetation to grow onto that. You can see plastic sheeting. I don't consider plastic sheeting a bank protection because it's just a temporary procedure. Even if it's left for a few years, it typically can't withstand dramatic changes. In the lower right, we see another example with a shotcrete channel with a thin veneer of fine sediment that's in there, but for sure it is shotcrete under that. And then in the lower right, we have a fence, which could involve some deep piers that are going into the bank to then hold up as a retaining wall against the hill slope. What if only part of the site is artificial composition? So it's the same rule we use with artificial shape. If greater than equal to 50% of the stream length is determined to be artificial composition, then the site is classified as artificial composition. And we say 50%, you have to factor in that there's two sides of the channel. So if the whole length of one side is artificial, it's artificial. If only half of one side is artificial and the other side is not artificial, now you're down to a quarter of the banks. So we're not going to be considering that artificial composition. I think there's a lot of nuances one can get into. What if, what if, what if? But this is the rule set that we've started out to define the classification. In this particular example in the photo, what I want to emphasize here is that probably this is a naturally incised channel in what we call this sort of stage two of this urban stream syndrome, with the down cutting but not yet much widening. And then they have a combination like of might be some concrete bags. You take 60, 80-pound bags of concrete and you stack them up and then you just wet them down, and then that turns into a wall. You can kind of see it in the distance. Or you may have something like that and then blasted with a coating of shotcrete, but you can see like very strong protection along the toe and then this wall. So even if the shape was originally natural, once you cover it like this, we consider that to be an artificial shape as well as artificial composition. In other words, if you have artificial composition, by definition, humans have made a mindful decision, and so it's therefore also an artificial shape. But in both cases, 50% is our threshold. What if the composition is only on part of the height of the bank? So in this photo, what you can see is the channel itself is cement, and then there's a natural material slope on both sides that's been specially, trapezoid on one side, to some extent on the other side, and then there's a paved sidewalk. We've taken the decision that regardless of how much of if you think of like the length of the bank from the toe of the channel up the bank all the way to wherever you get onto the valley floor away from the channel quarter, along that whole distance, if there is any length that's greater than 50% that is artificial material, we're considering it artificial. Applying the length rule, but across the length of the side slope, we don't have a rule for that. Basically, if there's something there and it's more than 50% of the length, then we're going to consider that. Now, I mean, probably if you get into some small limit where it's like, did they put some decorative rocks along the whole thing? You can use some judgment. I mean, there's a big difference with like whether it is structural. Like artificial composition means that the bank is composed of it, or the bed is composed of it. It's not just something that's sitting on the surface in a decorative way. I think if you evaluate, like in this case, the whole toe of this low flow channel, it's the lower part of the bank slope, it's all concrete. Even though that's a small fraction of the total cross-sectional height. And, in an artificial channel, again, there's no such thing as bankful. There's no 50% of what? Is it 50% of the base? Is it 50% up to the top of entrenchment? Like, we couldn't think of a particular decision or criteria that seemed right. So we just are saying for any amount of the side length of a slope, if more than 50% of the length, factoring in both sides, is artificial composition, then it's artificial composition. So the upper photo shows the case where the low flow channel has artificial bank composition. And then the bottom photo here, which is, I think, Alameda Creek and Niles Canyon, is showing the opposite. It's showing a natural riverbed in the middle, and even there may even be a bankful channel in here. I'm not going to speculate on that, but at some point then you get into a floodway of the river quarter here, where now you start to have a trapezoidal shape, and then we have this very heavy riprap, like slope protection, rock slope protection up here over a long length of the river. So this is both of these scenarios count as artificial composition as we define it. What if the artificial bed is covered? So I have mentioned this a little bit. A veneer of fine sediment is inconsequential to the processes in the river. And same thing, a vegetation veneer is inconsequential. What does that mean? It means that if you have like a winter storm come through, it's just going to push all that out. It may bring in more material, but this material is not controlling how the hydraulics work in the river. What are the processes? Of course, it can be influential for some amount of habitat, but in terms of defining the class of a river, it doesn't make it a natural riverbed. Now, what if you had 5 feet of fill, like it just filled up a lot, and to a point where you're in a long-term aggradational mode, the river's filling in, and the underlying concrete is totally irrelevant. And I can think of places like that, like maybe Sulphur Creek in Helena or something like that. Then, where you have a very high bed supply and it's overwhelming what the artificial situation was, it may once have been an artificial bed in terms of composition, but it has then evolved into a natural bed. That's okay. And then in the future, if it switches and loses its sediment supply, erodes back down, it can return to being an artificial bed again. That's how you evaluate that. Like just visually seeing the sediment isn't enough. You'd have to be convinced that it's thick enough that it's really controlling the processes in that setting. Another thing that you might see are scattered boulders. So, a lot of times you're in a lowland river and you see boulders around that don't look like they're natural to that setting. The boulders may have been placed as part of a habitat project of some kind. There's features people build, a double vortex rock weir or whatever. Those incidental boulders, they don't constitute bed composition. And I think the way to think about it is I get this from sedimentology theory. What is the matrix of the material, right? So you can imagine you have the stuff that makes the bed, and you may have things floating in it. For example, let's say you want to have a nice bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, and you put some raisins in it and you stir it up. The raisins are floating in the oatmeal. The oatmeal is the matrix of it, and it's essentially the framework of the bed. It's the majority of the material. It's what's against each other. The fact that you have some raisins floating in there, it's oatmeal with a couple raisins. It's not raisins with a little bit of oatmeal, right? So it's the same thing here. In this photo, you see a couple boulders. They're sitting on top of the bed, but they are not defining the structure of the bed. That's not to say that they can't be influential in creating local hydraulic habitats, but they aren't dominant for the bed. As you increase the number of those boulders, for sure, probably if you really have a boulder heavy river, it's also going to have gravel and cobble, and you will see that but then it's just a natural bed anyway. So really, to become an artificial bed entirely of boulders, that's only going to happen where you have a major stormwater channel over some length. They're really trying to dissipate some high energy in a steep subdivision of some kind. I have seen restoration or engineering projects that have done that, but you'd have to have it for 100 meters of length to make a 200-meter site artificial bed composition. Okay, that is the topic for composition.